important is I think it's important for board members to have an understanding as to how we got to where we are today with the current law. And that requires a brief history lesson. So in 2018, the original balcony bill, SB326, was authored in response to a fatal deck collapse in Berkeley. You've probably heard of that deck collapse. I believe 6 students died in that collapse. It was incredibly tragic. And so the legislature wanted to require these sort of mandatory inspections. And so a legislator came up with SB326. That original bill included apartments and condominium associations. And as we all know, apartments are very different than condominium associations, right? Apartment buildings are typically owned by one entity or one person who can arbitrarily make whatever decision he or she wants with respect to their building. Community associations, on the other hand, you know that there are some restraints and constrictions that govern how an HOA board can make its decisions, and there are limitations on those actions. And so ultimately, there was really no way for condominium associations to comply with many of the provisions in that original balcony bill. And so ultimately, what happened is a group called CAI, which stands for Community Associations Institute, they undertook efforts to try to extract condominiums from that original balcony bill through their committee called CLAC. And you'll see that on the slide here, CLAC, and that stands for the California Legislative Action Committee. And what that committee does, it's a nonprofit committee. It essentially tries to educate legislators about common interest development, living, and governance, and basically try to provide some context for these legislators making laws, because it doesn't seem like the legislators always understand how common interest developments work. And so CLAC realized that, hey, this original bill is going to be next to impossible for condominiums to comply with, so we need to extract condominiums from that law. And so CLAC, and one of my partners who does a lot of work with CLAC, went to the legislator who authored that original bill in 2018 and said, hey, let us out of this bill. Please don't make us comply with this. There's no way it's feasible for an association to comply with some of these requirements. It might work for apartments, it won't work for HOAs. And so there was a lot of back and forth. The legislator at first was not willing to extract condominiums from the bill, but ultimately CLAC was successful, and my partner played a big role in that, actually. But there was a catch. And the catch, of course, was the legislator told CLAC, okay, we'll take you out of this original bill, but next year, in 2019, you need to propose a law that is applicable to condominiums, because we still have this public safety goal. And so CLAC agreed. Amendments were offered that took condo associations out of that original bill. And then in 2019, they did indeed have to go back and author a new bill. Now, of course, what CLAC proposed was not exactly what got passed. Other groups got involved, the builders lobby got involved, other lobbyists got involved. And so the end product was not exactly what CLAC had proposed, but please keep in mind as we discuss this law tonight, that this is the better law for associations. If you're wondering how this law came about and you're not thrilled about it, I completely understand, but keep in mind it could be worse if condominiums were not extracted from that original bill in 2018. So it's better, it's not perfect, but it is better. And I'll point out some examples as we go through the slides tonight on how, how it could be worse, to provide some perspective. So the next slide will show you in a nutshell, and I won't go into this in detail, but at least once every 9 years, the board of HOA of a condo project shall cause a reasonably competent and diligent visual inspection to be conducted by a licensed structural engineer or architect of a random and statistically significant sample of exterior elevated elements for which that association has maintenance or repair responsibilities. I know that's a lot to unpack. And we will go through some of this, and I know Scott and Dean are going to cover a lot of this as well. Two important things to note at first: it applies to buildings containing 3 or more multifamily dwelling units, and the first inspection has to be completed by January 1st, 2025. No one's doing inspections on New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, so just assume you need to get those inspections performed in December 2024, or preferably before that. The next slide, how often? So this is one comparison. The original balcony bill had a 6-year inspection cycle. Under the law for associations, we got that moved out to a 9-year cycle, which is means less expense. We still think it's reasonable for the public safety goal of the law, but it's far more reasonable in terms of the timing. The next slide will show you what's the point, what's the purpose again, right? It's to ensure that the public safety goal is to ensure generally safe conditions for these components, and that these components that we'll talk about in more detail in the next few slides, that they're performing to applicable standards. So the exterior elevated, the next slide will show you key definitions. Again, I won't go into a lot of this because I know Scott and Dean will be focusing on this, but exterior elevated elements is defined by the law very clearly, and it talks about these are components that are load-bearing components together with their associated waterproofing system. One important thing to note is that the definition of load-bearing components, you have to check all 4 of these criteria in order for it to be satisfied. So just 1 or 2 doesn't count, you have to have all 4 of these. And again, once you read through these, you understand why, right? You are looking at components that extend beyond the exterior walls of the building to deliver structural loads to the building from decks, balconies, stairways, walkways, and railings. These components have a walking surface that are elevated more than 6 feet above ground level, right? The whole idea is if this collapses and someone falls, you know, you're not talking about something that's 1 or 2 feet off the ground. Most people are going to be fine with that. We are talking about elevated components. These components have to be designed for human occupancy or use, right? Decks, stairways, walkways, etc. And finally, what's going to be important for those of you who have projects, developments that were built in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, maybe even early 2000s, it's going to have to rely in substantial part on wood or wood-based products. So a lot of you may have wood frame decks and things of that nature. I know Scott's going to go into that in more detail, but the whole idea is that you're trying to keep water, which is the enemy, away from wood. And so that's why these criteria are listed. The next slide shows you associated waterproofing systems. This could mean flashings, membranes, coatings, sealants, basically everything that's trying to keep water away from those wood-based components. Visual inspection under the law is defined as inspection through the least intrusive method necessary, but it also allows for certain technology. Moisture meters, borescopes, infrared technology. Again, I'm going to defer to Scott and Dean on those. And then the last definition I think that's important to point out is statistically significant sample. And that is a sufficient number of locations inspected to provide a 95% confidence that the results from the sample are reflective of the whole, with the margin of error of no greater than plus or minus 5%. If anyone's taken a statistics class, you know that's a very high bar. And just keep that in mind. I will touch on that briefly and how that got included in the law in a little bit. The next slide, who can inspect? So it's not on the slide, but the difference between 721, the original balcony bill, and 326 is that under that original balcony bill, general contractors were included. Now, the reason general contractors were taken out of the new bill is because there was some concern that some general contractors might be interested in landing the repair job after and might inflate the issues during the inspection. Now you're fortunate, you're working with a management company that has the utmost integrity. They work with thoroughly vetted, reputable general contractors. So we're not concerned for your accounts, but keep in mind that there are some self-managed associations or associations with other management companies that perhaps don't offer the same level of protection that Collins provides to you. So the next slide, we'll talk about inspector obligations. Again, not going to spend a lot of time on this because I know this is something that Dean and Scott will be discussing in more depth. But basically, it's, the inspector has to generate a list, and it has to have all the components, those EEEs, exterior elevated elements, for which the association has maintenance or repair responsibilities listed in their CC&Rs. That list has to be given to the association for future use. The next slide also goes further with the inspector obligations. And really, the law is trying to give the inspector some discretion, right? The inspector gets to exercise their best professional judgment in determining whether additional inspections are necessary beyond that initial visual inspection, right? The whole idea is to try to figure out, is unintended water or water vapor getting in past the waterproofing system and into those load-bearing components that could cause structural decay or dry rot or damage, and thereby be a public safety hazard. So the next slide will give you a little better idea of the scope. The law we're dealing with has both quantitative and qualitative. Now remember, the apartment, the first original bill just had quantitative. It was just based on a certain percentage, certain sample size. So our law has both, and I think this is better. Quantitative is just what it sounds like. It's just based on numbers, it's pure random sampling. Qualitative relies on the inspector's best professional judgment. It gives more discretion to the experts you hire, and I think that's really, really important. Now, recall in the definition slide, I asked you to remember that statistically significant sample definition. Well, I want to point out that that precise language was not in the bill that CLAC authored. That was inserted at the 11th hour by a Senate staffer. It was objected to vehemently because it is a ridiculous standard. We don't know what happened. Maybe the Senate staffer took a stats class in college too and wanted to show off their knowledge. I'm not sure. It is our hope that CLAC will potentially propose cleanup legislation to delete that, but it is in the law that we have to deal with right now. We can't rely on, we can't sit around and wait to see if it gets cleaned up or if the legislature does their job and helps take that really onerous provision out. The law is what it is, and we are working with that standard right now. But I did want to point that out. That was not in the bill that was authored by CLAC. That got thrown in at the 11th hour, which was incredibly unfortunate. The next slide, we'll talk about the report requirements. Again, I know Dean and Scott are going to be talking about this, but all of these things make sense, right? The whole idea is to figure out what components are covered by the law that the HOA has repair and maintenance responsibilities for. You want your inspector to figure out what their current physical condition is, how long of a useful life they have left, and then recommendations for repairs or replacement. The big kicker at the bottom is that the report does need to be stamped or signed by the inspector, presented to the board, and then incorporated into your reserve study that's required by Civil Code Section 5550. So keep that in mind. The next slide. This is probably the #1 reason we were glad the original balcony bill did not apply to condos, that CLAC was able to extract it. This is sort of the biggest victory because the key difference between the two laws are notable. Under the current law that you're dealing with that applies to associations, non-emergency repairs can be performed in accordance with your reserve study schedule. So let's say you have a deck tune-up planned in 2 years, right? Maybe you're replacing the traffic coating, or you're going to touch up the caulking or sealants around the deck perimeter, or whatever your reserve study calls for. If the inspector who does your inspections, if they don't know any immediate safety or immediate hazard or threat to the residents, then anything they note can just be rolled into your reserve study schedule. That's huge, because the original bill it stated that repairs had to be completed within 120 days. Think about that, right? An association would have had to try to obtain competitive bids, interview and select a contractor, negotiate and execute the contract, all enough time to allow that contractor to still complete the repairs within 120 days. Basically impossible, right? Absolutely impossible. The legislator who wrote that initial language did not understand HOA governance or how associations operate. It would have been impossible to comply with that. So that was the biggest victory in getting condos extracted from that first law, because now non-emergency repairs, you can just perform them in accordance with the reserve study schedule. That in and of itself is a huge, huge win. And that assumes, right, the association, you have to think about budgeting for repairs. Had that initial law still applied to condos, how would you ever be able to raise money within 4 months? How would you get a special assessment passed or apply for a loan? Like it showed a complete disconnect on the legislator's part with respect to his understanding of how associations work and how budgeting works and how reserves work. So that was the big victory. All right, the next slide. If there is an immediate threat to the safety of occupants, which we hope when you have your inspections done that this is not the case, but a number of things are triggered. Again, I believe Dean and Scott will talk about this. The biggest thing I wanted to talk about is that the inspector is obligated to provide the report to local code enforcement, so building department, and they have to do it very quickly, within 15 days of completion of the report. And the other item of note is that the association needs to take preventative measures immediately. So you don't get to roll these repairs into your reserve study schedule. If there is an immediate threat to the safety of occupants, the association must take preventive measures immediately, which could mean preventing occupant access to the particular component. So if that's a deck, maybe you can just say, okay, stop using your decks, everyone. We have to get these repairs done. But if it's like a walkway or some elevated walkway where homeowners are using that to get to and from their unit, that could require potentially member relocation if they can't use those walkways and if the expert or inspector doesn't think it can be temporarily shored. So keep that in mind. Obviously, you're in good hands with Collins and Dean and Scott. They're going to get you through this, but listen to the experts. The next slide, just quickly, I always get a lot of questions. I haven't checked the chat box yet to see if this is a question. And it's not a bad question. I don't mean to disparage anyone that asked this because it's a valid question. But a lot of times we get asked by managers and board members, well, what's the fine if we don't comply, right? Because if it's cheaper than doing all this, we'll just pay the fine and it'll be fine. You know, it'll be great. We just don't want to do this. It's too expensive. Here's the problem with that. For some laws, that's a risk a board might be willing to take. As an attorney, I can't counsel any client to knowingly break the law. That would be very bad. I can't ethically do that. But sometimes a board may decide the risk is low enough that the best business judgment, the best business decision they can make is to not comply with something. That's a huge risk here because for a law like this that's designed to protect occupant safety, if board members ignore the law or fail to conduct the inspections or fail to listen to the inspectors who are experts or professional managers, that could open up the association to pretty extreme liability. And I would say 99% of the time that liability is not going to be something your insurance is going to cover for you if someone is injured or heaven forbid someone dies. So please be aware of that. I do want to go over the business judgment rule as a quick little reminder in case the board members on the call tonight may not recall that. So the business judgment rule protects board members from personal liability in the event something bad happens, an injury or someone's killed on your site, or even just accidents, right? But board members not shield themselves with the business judgment rule if they fail, willfully fail to comply with the requirements of the law. So it's very, very risky. And honestly, debt collapses do happen. It wasn't just the one in Berkeley. I know of several others. Thankfully, there were no fatalities in those situations, but there were hospitalizations with serious injuries. And this is not just older developments. The Berkeley debt collapse, that's only an 8 to 10-year-old project. So, it is a concern. So a quick reminder on that business judgment rule. Corporations Code 7231, that's something you could take a look at later, but it basically says a director shall perform the duties of a director in good faith, in a manner such director believes to be in the best interests of the corporation, and with such care, including reasonable inquiry, as an ordinarily prudent person in a like position would use. That's a lot to digest, I know. The biggest takeaway for tonight would be that of reasonable inquiry, right? That means you're inquiring and consulting with individuals that have specific knowledge about the subject matter at issue, right? So for this, you would be consulting with people with some construction knowledge and some legal knowledge on how to comply with the law. You retain the services of those individuals to offer their educated opinion on how to address the issue. You rely upon those opinions, and you make decisions in reasonable reliance on that opinion. If you follow that protocol, those rules, it's called safe harbor, right? The board members are protected, right? So participating in tonight's webinar is a great example. It's a great first step. Continuing to work with your professional management company, your legal counsel, your other experts, that's a great way to insulate your association from liability, but also protect you individually as a board member from liability. So the next slide, recommendations. Obviously, don't wait until 2024. Work with Collins, Scott, and Dean on this to develop a plan. Start to think about budgeting, right? You don't have to have a concrete plan right off the bat, but start to think about, will we potentially need a special assessment? Will we need to increase regular assessments? Should we consider a loan? Can we borrow from reserves? Lots of options. Try to locate the blueprints or architectural drawings for your associations now. Check your clubhouse, storage closets, original board members. You'd be amazed where we find original sets of plans. But that could help the individual inspecting on your behalf save a lot of money, because if they can look at those architectural drawings or plans and figure out which components are wood framed or what's not wood framed or what falls under the law, it might save them a lot of time and money in planning for this inspection. So if you have a set of those, that would be huge. It would go a long way, I think, to help the inspectors out. And if your association is under 10 years of age, work with your general counsel to determine the best strategy, because your builder may be on the hook for these costs, these inspection costs. Keep that in mind. Reach out to Paul or my office if you want more information on that. The next slide is we have prepared, we've been asked by some of our clients to come up with a roadmap on how in the world you can do this. And we've cut our prices just for Collins accounts. And what we do is my golden rule as an attorney is if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. And unfortunately, that's the world we live in today. So to have this letter memorializing the association's general maintenance and repair obligations that are imposed by 326, what the board's responsibilities are to minimize association and board member liability. And we will also detail all the different financial options that the association can consider when trying to fund these inspections or repairs. And because nothing is worse than getting a 5-6 page letter from a lawyer, even though we pride ourselves in writing in plain English, we also throw in a 30-minute video or teleconference with your board to discuss a written analysis and answer questions, so that we make it as easy as possible on you and can help you with this process. So if you are obviously interested in that, please mention that you're with Collins so that the special pricing would apply. We don't have to be your general counsel to perform that work. This is a relatively discreet assignment, but we'd love to work with you as general counsel anyway. But so that essentially wraps up. I will take a few questions. I hope that helped provide some context on the history of how we got to this law and where we go from here. And I know Dean and Scott will be providing more details on that. I'm going to open the chat box to see the questions here. It's like Paul answered that, and I'll state the questions everyone could hear. Looks like one question from Robin: on what grounds would the developer be responsible? That's a great question, Robin. So if your association is under 10 years of age, the developer would be responsible, and you could hold the developer responsible for the inspection costs as well as the repair costs. If you are over 10 years of age, you are more than likely out of luck. There would be very limited grounds to pursue the developer. I won't even go into them here because they likely do not apply to the bulk of all of you on the call, and I don't want to confuse anyone. But if you are over 10 years of age, it is very unlikely that your original builder or developer would be responsible, and that's because California law really has a very strict statute of limitations or legal deadline within which claims can be made. So if you're under 10, there's definitely, you've got great grounds. You've got very solid ground. If you're over 10 years of age, that's not going to be an option for 99.9% of you, I'm afraid.
Julie?
Yes.
We have quite a few folks that called in, and they don't have access to the chat box. I've tried this before, where I've tried to solicit calls when we have a bunch of people that have, or solicit feedback or comments from when we have a bunch of people that have called in, and it can get rather chaotic. But I'd like to give it a try. So if any, we'll see how it goes. And I apologize in advance. I may have to mute you if we get people talking over each other. But if somebody has called in and they have a question for Julie, please unmute yourself and ask the question. And then if anybody kind of comes into, okay, we got call-in user 1. You've unmuted yourself. What is your question?
Yeah, Julie, my question was, you said the original in 2018, what was the difference between that and 2019 as far as the condominiums were concerned? You had mentioned some of it, but are there any others?
You know, I hit the highlights. That's a great question. I hit the highlights.
And I'm sorry, I don't have your PowerPoint presentation because I'm on the phone and not on the computer. It wouldn't allow me access.
I understand. And I think this will be available. I'm not positive, but I believe it's being recorded. Okay.
Well,
I'm
sorry. Please continue.
Okay. So really, I hit the highlights. So basically, condominium associations, don't worry about that original bill. The only reason I raised that is to show and provide some context that even though this isn't, you know, a bill we're all celebrating, it does have a good goal in mind in terms of safety, resident safety. So don't worry necessarily about what that other bill provided for, because it does not apply to condominiums. It would have been impossible for condominiums to really adhere to many of those provisions, and I highlighted the primary reasons why. We'll focus on the new bill, but overall, I just wanted to provide that history to show it could have been a lot worse if condos had not been extracted from that first bill and had its own law developed just for condominiums.
Thank you. Does anybody else that called in have a question, or if you are with us via Zoom, you can always ask your question in the chat box. And there will be a follow-up Q&A at the end of Dean's presentation.
So Michael, I will email you if that's okay. I see your question unless Paul, you want me to tackle it. Michael's question is, does this law apply to PUDs where the homeowners, not the association, are responsible for the balcony and decks? So that's a great question. At first glance, I would say no. One of the first criteria is that it has to be a component that the association has maintenance and repair obligations for. But you know how unique some of the governing documents are for your accounts, right? And so that is something that I would make sure you get a letter from your general counsel for that account that says SB326 is not applicable for your planned unit development, so that board and Collins, everyone can be protected by, put that on the attorney, make them under that opinion. And so I would definitely recommend that, as opposed to just out of hand dismissing it because of the repair and maintenance obligations in the governing documents. Get that in writing. That's really, really important. Let's see. I'm going to leave that question, I think. I think that's more of a Dean and Scott question. Do you guys see that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, if there's no more legal question, I'll leave the cost question as well. I see that that's a great question on what this might cost. That's going to be up Dean and Scott's alley as well. Not so much for me. So if there's no other legal questions, I will let the other presenters.
Julie?
Yes.
I think that Kai Cotter has a good question. If no area extends beyond an exterior wall, are inspections still necessary?
So yeah, that would be up to the inspector to deem whether it's a load-bearing component. But my understanding, and Scott can correct me on that in his presentation, my understanding is that it has to extend beyond an exterior wall to deliver those loads, and then also meet all 4 of the criteria for the definition of load-bearing component.
Yeah, and I'm no attorney, obviously, but I was told by an attorney that if the walkway or deck is above living space, that it would not be subject to SB 326 inspections.
That makes sense, right? The whole idea is that it's not supported, and that the wood components are essentially, it's extending out, but you may not be able to ascertain the level of deterioration. And so if it collapsed, the idea is to prevent collapses like what happened in Berkeley. All right.
I see that somebody with a 571 area code unmuted themselves. Perhaps somebody else has a question.
Yeah. This is Jim Carr from University Lofts. I just wanted to ask, when will I got in late and I couldn't get on. The Zoom would not work, so I missed some of the presentation. So when will the presentation document be available?
We'll provide all of the PowerPoints as well as a video of this webinar to everybody that received an invite. So everybody in attendance this evening, as well as everybody who got the invite but is not attending, will all get all of that information, assuming that the recording is done appropriately by Ring Central.
Okay, thank you.
I had a question.
Go ahead.
I wanted to know if a homeowner built their own private deck onto a condominium, are they responsible for the repairs, and the association or the management company wouldn't be held responsible?
Well, that's a great question. I'm not sure if this has actually happened or if it's a hypothetical. Most condominiums.
No, it's happened.
Okay, so most condominiums would not allow a homeowner typically to build a deck onto the common area because of the potential liability and figuring out maintenance and repair obligations. We do see that sometimes with perhaps townhomes or PUDs, and of course, if it's a single family home, then that, you know, the law is not going to apply to the single family home. So I would have to know a bit more, but I would think that's a little bit unusual.
It's for a townhouse. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, if it was, you know, if your CC&Rs do not have, if that's the only unit with a deck, and it's the homeowner's own lot, and there's no exterior maintenance responsibility that the HOA has, then I would say get this in writing from your lawyer, but I would say that likely that's going to be the homeowner's responsibility and not something the association is going to have to inspect.
Okay, because I wanted to make that clear because it's a couple people who built decks on, and I just wanted to make sure they were liable for that.
Yeah, I would get an opinion in writing for the association's records from your general counsel, just so it's very, very clear that the law is not applicable to a separate interest. So definitely follow up with your general counsel on that, just to make sure then everyone's protected.
Okay, thank you.
So we have 2 more speakers, so we're going to have to move on. But if you had a question, either now or one pops into your mind, please email me at paul@collinsmanagement.com, and I will compile these questions. And when we have our monthly attorney hour, I'll get the answers and respond to you individually. But at this time, Julie, I thank you so much for your time and for your expertise. We greatly appreciate it. And you have a good evening, and we're going to move on.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for participating.
Okay. Bye, Julie.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Next, we have Scott Swinton. I feel compelled to make a disclosure. And the disclosure is that, and this is disclosed to all board members on an annual basis, is that UPSI is an affiliate company of Collins Management Company. What that means is that, you know, we rely on UPSI for, you know, when we have, you know, after hours emergencies and things like that. And they also do a fair bit of work, and they work for other management companies as well. But they are one vendor. And when we start moving forward in these projects, they are going to have opportunities to bid on this work, but they're not going to have any sort of special treatment. It's going to be a sealed bid process. And they are one of multiple bidders that we've already reached out to. In fact, we met with UPSI and 4 other companies that are offering these services. So the fact that Scott's here speaking does not mean that Scott and UPSI is going to be the company that's spearheading this work. We work with many companies, but Scott is very knowledgeable about this and has done a lot of the groundwork, has worked with engineers, and so I wanted to bring him on just so he can share his knowledge. But I just wanted to make that disclosure. So with that, Scott, I hand it over to you.
So hello, everybody. I don't have an Ivy to run my PowerPoint for me. So I'm assuming you can see my PowerPoint. Is that correct, Paul?
I can.
Okay, and you can hear me, I guess. So, there at the very beginning, I saw a bunch of faces I haven't seen for a long time. It was really good to see you guys. I am a general contractor. I have been working with homeowners associations for almost 20 years. And forgive me, the smoke in the air, I think, is getting to my voice. So I'm about an octave lower than I should be. But hats off to our last speaker, unbelievable. She covered everything very well. I'm going to take a slightly different direction. I will answer a lot of the questions she said I would answer. And if I don't, feel free to ask them later. I think we had some time limits for our presentations, and pretty much blew them out of the water already. So I'm gonna do my best to get us back on track and set my timer here. And I will talk fast, so if I talk too fast, feel free to jump in, Paul, and slow me down. SB326, understanding what's required and then making the best decision for your community. The key there is really what's best for your community. The protocols that an engineer is going to use to inspect your decks are not going to be the same as the protocols he used to inspect the previous decks in the previous community, and they're not going to be the same as for the community across the street. And I'll show you in a minute why that is. The key here is that we're trying to find a solution that fits for you in your community. It's good to remember why we're doing this. We did touch on this briefly in the last session, but there were 6 people that died and 7 people that were hurt in Berkeley. I was a part of the inspections, what Berkeley called E3 inspections. I inspected a lot of decks in Berkeley. They were the first to propose a law to inspect their decks. I was a part of that. I looked at a lot of them. I still get calls from people who go to the City of Berkeley's website looking for somebody to do these kind of inspections. And it's good to remember that this is why it happened, because you're going to get frustrated. When I start getting out into the weeds here, you're going to wonder, why are we even bothering? Why are we spending this money? Why are we doing this? Well, this is why. It hurts. It's going to be kind of expensive. I'll answer that question that was left open. How much is this going to cost? I'll answer that to a small degree, although it's going to be unique to your community. Our objective with the law is really to avoid 2020 Kittredge again. We want to inspect basically 3 criteria. We want to inspect enough. We don't want to miss the guardrails. We don't want to miss the deck coating. We want to inspect enough of the deck. So that's specified in the law. We want to inspect them well. We want to inspect everything on the deck. We want to inspect enough decks, and we want to do it timely. That's really what SB 326 is all about. And I'm going to get into 3 scenarios where I hope to break down maybe where your community is at. And if you can see your community in one of these 3 scenarios, you might have some idea of how to proceed. And at the end, I'm going to provide my email address. I have all of these 3 scenarios in a write-up, basically paragraph format. So as I go too fast and talk too fast and don't cover all the details, you can pick this all up from me. Just email me and I will send it to you. So 3 scenarios, 3 fictitious communities. First of all is Fairhaven, where everything is just fine. The other one is DK Villas, where everything's a disaster. And then Gray Skies HOA, where most of you live. And I'll try to spend the most time on the last one because it's the most difficult. I'm going to make some assumptions in this presentation. One of them is that the inspections are for 100 decks, so your community has 100 decks, and that it's $100 per inspection, and it's not. My experience so far is that it's significantly more than that. I'm seeing inspection costs of anywhere from $400 to $1,000 per deck, and take a minute, get your breath back. And a lot of that has to do with the requirements of the law that were just communicated. So let's start with Fairhaven, and I'll go through Fairhaven pretty quickly. Fairhaven is 8 years old, has decks that were well built. The waterproofing's been inspected annually. They've done all the right things. They've maintained them, they've painted them, and they're not that old. Unfortunately, Fairhaven still has to inspect their decks. So you hire an engineer, and the engineer comes out and starts looking at decks, and they create that randomized sampling of the decks, and everything they open looks good. Everything's beautiful. They contact the statistician. The statistician says, In order to reach your 95% confidence, you need to open maybe 30, 40, 50 decks. It's going to depend solely on the opinion of the statistician. And so the engineer will then begin opening that many decks in order to get that 95% confidence that all of the decks he's looking at are a representative sample of the rest of the community. When he's done, he will send a glowing report to your HOA and you'll be done, except that you will still have some items to cover. One of them is going to be closing up all those holes. So what are your DT repair costs? I'm going to start with the second point here. You have to close all those holes. The inspector opened up a bunch of stuff. He might have opened soffits. He might have opened the siding beside the deck. And he did that at 30, 40 decks. And so those are all going to have to get closed. That's going to be 2 to 3 times the cost of the inspections. Now, I've used that number of $100 per deck, which is completely fictitious. But if you look at point number 1, you're at $4,000 to $5,000 or some multiple of that per deck for those inspections. The repair costs for the destructive testing where they open those areas could be 2 to 3 times that cost. Now, if you're in Fairhaven and the inspector can use a borescope and open tiny holes, that number might come down. They might be able to open little holes and stick a camera in there and see what they need to see. Unfortunately, the engineers and architects that I'm talking to are concerned that they can't see what they need to see through just those holes. And so it's going to solely depend on the particular architect or engineer that we're working with. I work with multiple architects and multiple engineers, and each of them has a different method and a different criteria that they want to use to look at the decks. And frankly, I use specific architects and engineers for different customers based on the needs of that customer. And remember, all of this is about what is your need and what you can afford and comply with the law. Your reconstruction costs at Fairhaven are 0. You're not going to have to go rebuild a bunch of decks because they were all good. And the moral here is inspect as absolutely few decks as the statistician allows. You're not cutting corners, you're meeting the obligation of the law. And whatever the statistician says you need to open to get to that 95% confidence, that's all you want to open. Decay villas is the other easy one. This is the one that's terrible. They're a disaster. And when the engineer walks on site, she looks around and she sees all of these balconies that are hanging off the buildings. The railings are about to collapse. The columns are rotted at the bottom. This is the one where the engineer calls the building department and says, hey, by the way, we have a problem. He has to do that, or she has to do that within 15 days. That report goes to the HOA. The HOA does a bunch of shoring to prop everything up. And then the engineer stops. The engineer doesn't go through and continue an SB326 inspection. You do not want an SB326 inspection on all the decks that are obviously bad. What you do here is you shut it down. You hire a construction manager. The construction manager puts together a scope of work. They get that engineer back in to provide a set of plans for each of those decks, and you start a reconstruction project. What you don't want is to have an engineer, some private engineer, go through and give you the report that says you have a problem. Well, we already know we have a problem. As soon as the engineer walked on the job site, she saw that. So she stops the inspections. She tells you you have a reconstruction project ahead of you, and the inspection cost is 0, or maybe a fee to that engineer to come on site. Your destructive testing repair cost is 0. You're not going to be closing a bunch of holes from destructive testing. You're going to be able to push all of those funds toward the reconstruction project, and you're going to be able to pay the construction manager and the engineer and the contractor eventually to do the work that needs to be done. Your reconstruction costs are going to vary depending on how many decks you have, the type of decks, how high they are off the ground. There's no way you can predict that right now. And the moral to this is inspect no decks at the outset if they are obviously bad, and save all that money for reconstruction. There is a misconception out there that you have to do both. You have to have an engineer go through and look at all the decks, give you a report that's very dim and discouraging, pay that engineer for that report, and then start the process. You don't. If you can see immediately that you're bad, you stop inspecting decks. The engineer hangs out with you for the whole process, and they watch all of these decks get reconstructed. And at the end of the project, they send you your report that meets all of those report criterias, those report requirements. And it's a glowing report because now all of your decks are in great condition. If that process takes you past 2025, don't worry about it. The engineer sends in the same report that says you're under construction, you're solving the problem, and these are the decks that have been completed, these are the ones that aren't. And then at the end of the process, they revise that report and give you the one that says you're in good shape. Gray skies condos. Here's where most of you live. Decay villas was obvious. They have a big problem. The engineer walks away and says, I'll work with you through the process. Fairhaven was obvious. The decks are brand new. Too bad you have to open them all. It really stinks that you have to spend all that money to open decks that are brand new, perfectly good, but you do. Gray Skies is not so obvious. At Gray Skies Villas, you're 20 to 30 years old. You've had sporadic maintenance. A few decks have been replaced. A joist here, a joist there. Maybe deck coatings have been replaced every 8 to 10 years. But it's not obvious. What's not obvious is the damage, the actual repairs that were done in the past. The photo I have here is of a deck that you can clearly see the joists from the bottom. The problem is I'm only showing you a third of the building. That deck is 60 feet off the ground. That one's hard to look at. Maybe there's a soffit that covers the bottom of those deck joists. And that soffit is either stucco or plywood, and it has to be removed to inspect those decks. Gray Skies gets complicated, and I'll try to go through it quickly. But if indeed Gray Skies is miraculously wonderful, you have no problems with your decks, then you are actually Fairhaven. You can follow that procedure. The inspector, the engineer, or the architect is going to look at a few decks with his randomized sampling. He's going to talk to the statistician, find out how many total he has to look at, and then he's going to be able to give you, with that randomized sampling, the 95% confidence that all the rest of the decks are like these and they're great. One thing to watch out for, if he does find one or two that's bad, then that's going to raise the number of inspections. And rather than looking at 40 decks out of 100, the inspector might be looking at 50 or 60 or 70 to get that 95% confidence. Again, if this can be done relatively inexpensively from ladders or with borescopes, all the better. The destructive testing repair costs are going to be similar to Fairhaven. We're just going to have to close up what was opened. And again, it could be 2 to 3 times the cost of the actual inspections. Reconstruction costs, not applicable. You didn't have to replace any decks. And the moral, again, is inspect as absolutely few as the statistician allows you to inspect. Gray Skies condos outcome B. This is the worst case scenario. I'm calling this B1, where you find various failures and you're still inspecting. And this is where you hire an architect or an engineer, and they go out and they start looking at decks, and they get kind of on a roll. And they're inspecting deck after deck and saying, oh, this one has a little problem here, and this one has a little problem there, and this one isn't good, and that one's no good. And eventually you get a report from the engineer or the architect that says, you have a bunch of problems. And you fail your inspection, because they never can reach that 95% confidence that all the decks are good. So now you're paying for an SB326 inspection, and you have to close up all those holes. The DT costs are right up there again, because you have to close all those openings that they opened in their failed attempt to prove that the decks were in good condition, and you still have reconstruction costs. You have to rebuild all the decks anyway. So this is worst case scenario. And the moral here is stop the inspections if consistent failures are identified, and then transition back to a scenario 2 with you find out that actually we're decay villas. We have a bunch of work ahead of us, and just shut down the inspections. We don't need a full SB326 inspection right out of the gate. Back off and let the reconstruction process turn you into fair haven, where you now have a glowing report from the engineer saying, I observed all of these decks being rebuilt and they're all in good condition. And then Gray Skies condos scenario in the outcome B2, where there are various failures and you hit the brakes. This is where you actually do what I just described. You start recognizing that there's a deck here, a couple joists over there, and the engineer comes to you and says, I'm stopping. I'm not going to continue spending your money because you have a reconstruction project ahead of you. You're going to pay the engineer for a few inspections. You're going to pay the engineer and the contractor for repairing a few holes that they open to do the DT. And then you're going to head into a reconstruction project. You're going to call your construction manager, and they're going to put together a scope of work. They're going to work together with the engineer to get a set of plans and some specifications. They're going to call out the contractors to bid the job. You'll be able to select a contractor and get the reconstruction going. And again, you don't have to worry about, did we get in our report before January 1st, 2025, because you're under construction. You're taking care of the problem. And the deadline, that 120 days to solve the problem, as you described, is not an issue for you. You're in a reconstruction process. If there were dangerous decks, they were reported and shored up. And so you're moving forward at your pace to deal with this. And again, the moral is when consistent failures are beginning to manifest during the inspections, stop. Don't keep paying an engineer to tell you what you already know, that you have a problem. And then get that report from the engineer at the end when everything really is in good condition, and they're going to send you that report. You're going to file it away, and you'll be good to go for another 9 years. Hire the right team. I love Dilbert. Can everybody, I'm going to assume you can't read it. I'll read it to you. Our scope needs to be calibrated, says Dilbert. Do we have a budget for that? And the boss says, we can save a few bucks by sending it to my friend Elrod. He likes to tinker. And Dilbert says everything about that idea is bad. And the boss says you should see the car he made from a bathtub. And we all understand. You get the wrong person doing the job. You bring in an engineer who is a buddy of a buddy, and they've never heard of SB326, and they think they can patch it together for you and get you your inspections. It's probably a bad idea. Work with reputable firms who know what they're talking about. And my final piece of advice would be avoid working directly with engineers. I would start with a construction management company. The engineer is going to be unlikely to want to pivot away from inspections. His money's coming from inspecting decks. And then a construction management firm is going to be able to pivot very quickly. And they're going to say, wait a second, we're going to stop inspecting, and we're going to help you move into the phase that you should be in, which is reconstruction. All right, that was really fast. I don't know if I made up any time or not. But again, if you want those 3 scenarios in writing, feel free to email me, scott@upsionline.com. And I'll pass it along to Dean now, and then I'm happy to answer questions at any point.
Hey, Scott, before you run off, there was a question. Somebody mentioned that 40 out of, you put out the number 40 decks might be inspected out of 100 to get the 95 percentile. I know you're not a statistician, but Robin's comment was that it was quite low. I just wanted to respond and just say that Scott's not a statistician. It'll be up to the statistician to determine the 95% confidence. And cool. I think that's above both of our pay grade. So I just want to make it clear.
I've heard estimates all over the board. So in probably it's your attorney and your statistician that you should talk to about that, because I've heard anywhere from, well, it's 95% confidence, you have to inspect 95% of the decks, all the way down to numbers as low as 30%. That, you know, my statistician says we can achieve this by looking at 30% of the decks. So Paul's exactly right. You got to talk to the correct professional to get the correct answer.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Scott. I appreciate your expertise, and hopefully you'll stay on so that if there are some more questions that pop up after Dean's presentation, you can jump in on that as well.
Yeah, no worries.
Dean, handing it over to you. You're on mute.
Thank you. All right. Give me one moment, please, and I will share my screen. Okay, I'm here to talk about Collins Management's role in navigating the balcony bill and the inspection process. The objective, as we all know, is to avoid injury and death. So whether you like the bill or not, it has good intentions. At Collins, we've realized that your community can benefit from somebody who has a wide range of experience and can exclusively focus on projects and act as the bridge between the manager, the contractors, the experts, and really leave the manager not having to reinvent the wheel. They have time to manage their community. And that's where I come in. My name's Dean. I come to this position with 20 years in the community management industry. You can see I'm bald, that's why. I have experience managing high-rise buildings, mid-rise buildings, condos, planned developments, and single-family homes. I've trained other managers and managed large and small projects, from re-roofing a high-rise building to boiler replacement, to waterproofing, to negotiation of telecommunications contracts. And now I'm specializing in the administration of the specialized projects, such as the balcony inspection process. You might ask, if this isn't due until 2024, the end of 2024 at that, why do we need to start now? And the fact is, there are so many associations in California and so many decks to inspect and elevated elements that there are simply not enough licensed structural engineers and architects to complete all of the necessary inspections. And there are fewer still who are going to be willing to put their license and their insurance on the line to do it, because there's heavy liability involved. So I recommend that you avoid the last minute mad rush and that you get on their radar now and start getting proposals. At the very least, you'll be able to budget for the project going forward. And I've developed a pre-qualified list of inspectors. These are companies that have access to licensed structural engineers and architects, and I'm working with them to streamline the process so that we're all on the same page, so that they can present the board of directors with a clear path forward and a clear proposal that you can understand. And as Paul mentioned, it's not only Scott at UPSI. We have several bidders, and everybody's treated absolutely fairly with no favorites. So here's how we expect the projects to go. And I'm going to defer to Scott on the specifics, but I will work on the selection of the inspectors and manage the bidding process, and then help the inspector develop their protocols, just with an idea towards limiting negative experience for the residents and homeowners, and just trying to identify areas that might be problematic so that the impact can be reduced. And then once the visual inspections begin, I will manage the project through to completion. Now, if that means your association has no repair recommendations, then I would just manage it and then you would get their final report. If you have a safety issue that has to be immediately addressed, I would manage that through the construction process till that completion. And in most cases, you may very well need further inspections, either to get to that 95% confidence, or you'll discover that you need a reconstruction process. And we can manage through the reconstruction process till that's done as well. So step one, this is the selection of the inspector. Now, we work with the board of directors and with the manager to create a preliminary scope of work. Now, this means we assess the approximate number and type of exterior elevated elements. We assess possible difficulties and impediments so that can be factored into the bidding process. And then we make sure that the bidders are all on the same page so that they return apples to apples bids as much as possible. And then we review the proposals and make sure that none of the other bidders know what each other's bids. I would recommend that legal also review the proposals, because we want to know that, that the contract requires appropriate errors and omissions coverage, liability coverage, and appropriate indemnities for the association. And then we facilitate the awarding of the contract. And again, the contract needs to be reviewed by legal. And then we go on to the actual inspections. We work with the inspectors as they develop their specifications and their protocols, again, so that we can identify any areas of concern, any areas that might be impactful to the homeowners, and we figure out where they stage their equipment and their materials. We set schedules with them so we know when they're going to be on site. We make sure that they're going to be cleaning up after themselves at the end of the day. And we're the hub of communication. We will manage the communications with the inspectors, contractors, management, the board of directors, so that surprises are avoided. And we also will communicate with the homeowners so that they know what to expect. There are times that the inspector is going to need access into the units. So we would communicate with the resident or the owner and make sure that that can happen on a timely schedule that's not too impactful to the owners. And we don't just wind this thing up and let it go. We'll have periodic on-site meetings. We want to be on the same page with the inspectors and the contractors so that there are no surprises. We want to be able to communicate with residents in advance so that they're not surprised either. We want to be able to communicate any issues with the board of directors. So we'll be on site to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And we'll review the invoices before we pay them. We'll track them against the budget. If there are variances, we'll explain why. And we'll also review the any change orders that might come in. We'll review them first with the inspectors, and then we will provide our recommendations to the board of directors. And ultimately, towards the end of the project, we'll identify punch list items, go over them with the inspector and the contractors, and attend final walkthroughs to make sure that the punch list items are addressed in a timely manner. And the third step, if the inspection is not a success, we can help you go forward into a reconstruction project. Collins has the resources to help to figure out the financing and the planning for the project, and we also have the capability of managing the project through to its completion. All right, so you might ask how much it costs. I'm pretty sure you will. Well, as Scott mentioned, all the associations are different. So we can't know the cost because it will vary from association to association depending on their size and the extent of the inspections and repairs that might be needed. But the hourly rate for the service is exactly the same as your manager's hourly rate for special projects. So to reiterate, with all of the uncertainty and confusion about the balcony bill, you can benefit from an established and streamlined process that lets your manager not have to reinvent the wheel. They can focus on managing the community. And that includes me, a project manager who has a laser focus on the balcony bill, and I know its ins and outs and a clear understanding of the inspection process. a pre-qualified list of inspectors with a clear line of communication, and we can manage the process through the completion of any necessary construction while your manager has time to manage your community. So thank you for your time. Again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat room, or if Paul wants to let people in who are calling, that would be great too. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. Yeah, if you called in and you have a question, go ahead and chime in right now, and then I'll monitor the chat box. Robin, you're just a wellspring of great questions. One community I'm on the board of has metal structures for our balconies. Are we automatically exempt, or do we need somebody to come out to check and write a report saying it's metal?
Want to take that, Scott, or should I?
Yeah, I would recommend just hiring a consultant to come out and look at them and verify. The bill specifically states that if there are any wood components, that you fall under the bill. So it may look like it's metal, and if there's any wood components involved, you would have to still get those inspected. Paul, do you know what HOA that is? I might know it.
Robin, which HOA is it? The veranda.
Veranda might be okay, but yeah, they should get a consultant out there to take a look at those. I do know those structures, and I know what she's talking about.
Okay. Any other questions before we sign off? Well, again, I'm going to compile the PowerPoints. I'm going to get a hold of Scott's scenarios that he has written out in narrative form. And also the video, again, assuming the video has recorded properly, and push all that information out to you.
Paul, there's a question from Allison. Mind if I answer it?
I have a question.
Okay, just one moment. We're going to answer Allison's question first, and then you can ask. Go ahead, Dean.
Hi, Allison. Honestly, it is going to vary from association to association. Initially, the actual bidding process probably won't take too long at all, maybe 10 to 13 hours, I would think, if that. But the time on site and the time managing the project is really going to depend on what the inspector finds. If they find that there's no repairs involved, then my time there will be very brief. If they find that there are a lot of repairs or a lot more inspections involved, that's going to add to the hours. So at this point, unfortunately, it's not known. Now, once the inspectors provide their proposals, we might be able to narrow it down because we'll have an idea of what we're looking at. But right now, at the beginning and outset of this, it's a little difficult to tell.
Okay, sir, with the 571 area code, your turn.
Yes, this is Jim from University Lofts, and I was picking up from the answer to a question just a moment ago. Did you have maybe visuals or plans of the different buildings? Our building does not have any exterior balconies that jut out beyond the homeowners' units, except the balcony. We have an open, we're an L-shaped building with a courtyard, and so there is a balcony that runs to each unit, you know, from the elevator. There are two that are above what you would call ground level. The courtyard is on the second floor, so there's two above that level, two balconies. They're very long balconies since they cover the length of the L. But they are metal railings and so on. So I mean, visually, I don't see any wood. I guess you would recommend that someone take a look, because maybe there's some interior wood, but I just wondered if, first of all, because we don't have any balconies that jut out beyond the homeowner's own units, does the bill apply to us? And then second, do we need an inspection just to confirm that there is no wood?
I would say yes and yes. So to answer the first part, walkways are absolutely yes in the bill.
Okay.
Again, I'm somewhat familiar with your building. I'm trying to pull up some photos of it over here, and I'm not getting there yet. But yeah, the second question is yes. You need to have, the answer to the second question is yes. You need to have a consultant, a contractor, preferably somebody who is working with an engineer to go out and look at it and make sure that it does not fall under the law. That person should talk to your attorney and make sure that your attorney agrees. And then the broader question of walkways, yes, walkways are always in the law. And yours are somewhat unique where they don't extend beyond the outside footprint of the building. But I think the intent of the law is to prevent elevated elements from collapsing. And so it would be a really far stretch for your walkways not to be included in the law.
Yeah.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, folks. And if any, and I'm sure as this process continues, you're going to have more questions. You can always direct those questions to your manager, and the manager has access to legal advice, to Dean, to Scott, and all the other vendors that we work with. So if some other questions do come up, please let your manager know, or you can email me at paul@collinsmanagement. Christine G, I did look at University Lofts and that link that you sent, and yeah, that looks like it's those would definitely be raised elements, and I think that they would be subject to SB326. I just did a brief check, but it looks as though those balconies do not have living spaces beneath them, and they're above 6 feet off the ground, so they would be included in SB326. Well, with that, I will say goodnight. Again, I'm gonna send you all the information from tonight. If you have any follow-up questions, it's paul@collinsmanagement.com, or you can ask your manager. Thanks again for taking a bit of your evening off to educate yourself and to be a better board member. I think it's very important, and I salute you, and thank you. And with that, we'll sign off, and I hope you all take care, and see you at the next webinar. So long, everybody.